Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles, host of the Angelo Robles podcast and the founder at Family Office Association. Today, we're going to cover NFTs meets carbon credits. It features Tom Herman, CEO of Metacarbon, and really excited about today, taking two incredibly interesting subjects that absolutely, as you're going to learn, could work together. We're going to go really deep with Tom. And even if you don't know too much about NFTs or carbon offsets, truly, you're going to learn it all today. And again, how in this example, at least, they came together. Before we get started, I did want to give a quick shout out to our good friend, David Talbot at Accordia, and really the whole team. There are data integration technology partners for arranging today's wonderful speaker. The energy crisis, well, that's something that we've also had a discussion with David about, and absolutely on the carbon offsets will play into that. So we're going to weave a lot into today. Why don't I at least start by being courteous? Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here with you today, Angelo.
Thank you. You have an incredibly unique background, and you're finding yourself really at the center of what I think is going to be this kind of mega trend. If you could talk, and normally I don't open this way, you normally get a wicked question for question number one, but I think what you're doing is so unique, it does require, I think, for our audience, a little bit of context.
Sure. So the question, I think, is what's a carbon offset?
Well, tell us about yourself and what led you to doing what you're doing.
About myself. Got it. So I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've lived in a lot of different places around the world and started quite a few different companies, one of which was featured in the artisan entertainment movie GovWorks, about GovWorks called Startup.com. And if you watch that movie, you will see that early on in my life, I was really a tree hugger. I was a software guy and a tree hugger. There's a meditation moment in the woods in that movie where I bring my team of executives to meditate in some tall pines. So forestry, trees, the environment have been important to me for a long time, but most of my work has been in building double-sided marketplaces. I've built a video advertising marketplace. I've built one of the first international video streaming companies, online streaming companies. And more recently, I was involved with a company based out of Singapore where I was living called Air Carbon that was doing B2B carbon offset trading. And in doing that, eventually I moved back to the United States and decided I wanted to be involved with retail carbon offsets. And that's when I started my current company, Metacarbon.
Excellent. And why don't we start, like you said, I think it would be good for the audience to understand exactly what are, for those that don't know or could use a better definition, what are carbon credits, carbon offsets? What does that mean?
Yeah, well, both the carbon offset and the NFT are actually kind of complicated topics. And I've been working to try and describe them both in ways for different audiences, because sometimes I get too technical. But at a fundamental level, a carbon credit is a permit that allows a company that holds it to emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide. Carbon credits are half the market mechanism called cap and trade. Companies which can't stop polluting immediately, for example, like airlines and some power generators, are awarded credits that allow them to continue to pollute up to a certain limit, which is reduced periodically until it reaches zero. So as a result of the Clean Air Act in 1990, the Kyoto Protocol, which was 1997, and the Paris Accords from 2020, nations are allotted a certain number of credits, and they can trade them to help balance the total worldwide emissions. We just had COP26, and so there's some updates that have been happening internationally. But one thing that was amazing about the climate agreement in Paris is that it was signed by more than 190 countries, including the United States. So that's at a high level what they are. More simply put, a carbon credit is, or a carbon offset is someone capturing 1 ton of carbon so that someone else can emit 1 ton of carbon. You can capture a ton of carbon by planting a tree, protecting a forest, by capping a landfill that's emitting methane, by capping an old coal mine or oil wells. There are many different ways to capture methane and CO2 that would generate a carbon offset.
And I agree in terms of the definition, sometimes more complex and breaking it down. What's the old adage that we always hear? Talk as if you're talking, everyone changes it, but to a bunch of fifth graders. And I think that's something we all can learn from. Actually, that's a wonderful philosophy to follow. Now I'm going to ask you to do the same on NFTs.
Well, NFTs, we won't go into the math, but basically NFTs are digital receipts. They're digital receipts that are unique and individual. In the case of crypto in general, you have fungible and non-fungible, but the rest of the world has that as well. So in the world of reality, a dollar is fungible. In many cases, although not all cases, a barrel of oil or a bushel of grain is fungible. If I have a dollar and you have a dollar, we can swap. On the other hand, my baseball card and your baseball card may not be exactly fungible, because mine might be a Mickey Mantle and yours might be someone unknown, although more likely the other way around. And the same is true with real estate deeds, right? So two properties are different. They're non-fungible. My house might be bigger or smaller or in a different location and worth a different value. Well, non-fungible tokens, NFTs, are the same thing. They represent, in some cases, in the simplest of cases, they represent a piece of artwork, a digital artwork, and it uniquely identifies you as the owner. Now, someone can still rip it off, but digital rights management is not a new issue, right? So someone can rip off a Beatles song as well. And put it on their iPod when they don't own it. Someone can rip off your CryptoPunk or your Bored Ape and use it, but they don't actually own it. And in fact, someone could rip off the Mona Lisa and have a very high fidelity replica in their home, but it's still not the real one. And everybody can tell, and there's a certain prestige to being the Louvre that has the real one, or being the owner of one of these more rare Bored Apes.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually what you just said is one of the kind of examples that I sometimes give, and maybe over repeated to my audience. I may have to retire it. But for those that sometimes have a hard time wrapping their arms around the digital art perspective of NFTs, and really it's digital scarcity, is, well, it's a JPEG. Well, I could buy millions of replicas that are going to look great of the Mona Lisa. I could buy a beautiful frame, and in my home, it's going to look pretty darn good. Do you know what its value is? I'm going to put it pretty close to zero. Maybe if the frame has gold lining, it's all going to be in the frame, but nothing to do with the picture. And somewhat incredibly similar with a limited number of, again, verified on the blockchain for digital scarcity of an NFT from a digital art perspective, but so much more, like you said, perhaps in the future with stock certificates, with deeds, with driver's license and passports, which is why I tell people, even if you're not buying into the digital art perspective, we're actually going to talk a little bit about that later with some questions I have, not understanding blockchain and NFTs and how wallets are going to interact, you're going to have a hard time. Okay, maybe not the next year, but the next 5 to 7 years interacting in society, let alone from the perspective that we're talking about. But I don't mean to digress.
Can I just throw one really small point on that? If you happen to be a high net worth individual, you happen to be involved with the world of finance, and you're not aware right now that blockchains like Cardano and Solana and Ethereum are fundamentally rewiring the entire global finance system, you're going to be in a lot of trouble.
I completely agree. Now, we both are going to make angry at us, the Bitcoin maximalist, but why don't I bide my tongue? And some of them are friends of mine. We just
Bitcoin's
disagree
great
on many things.
Bitcoin's great, but it's not rewiring the finance industry. It's replacing gold.
Now we're both going to get hate emails, but it's okay. It's okay, Tom. We don't mind a little bit of controversy.
Right.
So your resume details, and you spoke a little bit about it, many years of experience really in two distinct disciplines. I'm going to say kind of blockchain, and now that really is encompassing Web3, NFTs, and blockchain, but let's try to keep it simple, and carbon. What is the mission that is driving you as an entrepreneur that you're seeking to address?
Well, that's interesting. So I see metacarbon as a bridge to fund social and environmental capital flow into projects that are established to reduce carbon emissions and improve the habitats of endangered species. That's where financial and social returns are really the same. We're looking for a financial return and a social return. We seek to do well for shareholders while also doing well for society. That's it. High level.
That's real, clean, and simple, and something that a fifth grader could understand. So, so now
Thank
we
you,
know it's
David
good.
Talbot, for helping me to soundbite all my thoughts. I have wonderful people around me that are really helping me. It's complicated to get the right words. So I've been wordsmithing for months to come up with the basic idea. And really, I see myself building the consumer interface for the carbon economy.
That's fantastic. So you mentioned like the conference COP or COP, say 21, recently wrapped up in Glasgow, Scotland. Yeah. While many journalists sought to categorize the event as, I'm going to say, like a failure to rein in fossil fuel usage, there was much also to celebrate. What are your key takeaways?
Well, I think there's a few key takeaways. It's exciting that, for example, China has agreed to stop building coal-fired power plants outside of China. I think China has a long track record of under-promising and over-delivering. You know, for regardless of how you feel about China, the reality is they've done a lot of good, a lot of bad, but no question they've done a lot over the last decades. So if they can over-deliver on that, that will be great. I think there's a whole bunch of really important large countries like Brazil that have agreed to end deforestation. So it's easy to make promises. It's much more difficult to follow through. And I think it's important that everybody keep all of these entities accountable for what they've promised. We need to vote. We need to vote with our wallets. We need to vote with our investment portfolios. And we need to vote at the ballot box, especially if you have children, because this is maybe not as big an existential risk for you and me, but certainly for our children. I think it's going to be a serious issue because climate is going to continue to change. It's not a question of stopping climate change. It's only a question of being able to moderate it enough that enough humans survive.
If a company that creates the carbon credits offsets, but like who audits or checks that my credit, quote unquote, is legit?
Well, there's a softball for blockchain. Softball question for blockchain. So one of the things about the carbon industry is it's very distributed. There are carbon projects all over the world. There are measurement companies, verification companies, and reporting companies all around the world that are doing different kinds of work based on different methodologies and standards for measuring carbon and impact of investing in carbon. And there's a lot of different registries where the carbon offsets that are generated can be registered. And then on top of that, there's a whole bunch of exchanges and brokers where these offsets can be bought and sold. So this is a distributed, trustless environment, which is really perfect for blockchain. We need to be pushing on digital IDs for all of the members in the entire ecosystem, so that when you record on blockchain, you know, $15 on a carbon offset associated with some consumer activity, that you can track that back to the exchange, to the registry, to the project, and to the measurement entities that measured the size of the trees and the height of the trees and the carbon biomass.
Yeah, I mean, that is kind of the magic as this incredible ledger that blockchain really is. And again, now give credit to Satoshi. Really, the Bitcoin blockchain was truly extraordinary and iconic. And again, others from Vitalik with Ethereum, and as we've seen Solana really explode in the last year or so. It really is an amazing time. I mean, I'm going to get a little off track for a second, but we gave the examples of art before. If someone were to lose their keys or get them stolen, let's say they get them stolen via MetaMask or whatever, like, okay, a bad actor, quote unquote, has the keys in their wallet, but what happens now if that bad actor tries to move, you know, fence that piece of digital art? They could enjoy it for their own use, but they can't really do much with it.
Well,
Like,
didn't we just see a huge heist of crypto, Bitcoin, and the rest of the crypto community said, we're going to watch those wallets and you're going to return the money because you can't do anything with it. And they did. It was truly extraordinary.
yes, yes. And I know that's a little off topic from what we're talking about, but I'm going to show kind of all of you the power of that Web3 blockchain and NFT. And there's like just so many vast uses of it. For sustainability minded investors, when a company says they are carbon neutral due to the purchase of carbon credits, is this viewed the same as modifying operations in such a way that the carbon is actually minimalized in the production of a company's goods? That was a lot there.
But that's a good question. I get your point. And the short answer is no, it's not the same. Everybody, every corporation, every government, every individual needs to look at their own carbon footprint and do their best to reduce it. But if we're realistic, the world is not going to stop flying today. So if you're going to continue to fly, or we're going to continue to use electricity, and we're not going to have the economy collapse, then we're going to continue to emit carbon. So the point is, we want to reduce it as much as possible. We want to reduce it as quickly as possible, but there's no reason not to be carbon neutral immediately by paying somebody else to do the opposite of emitting carbon. And that's where we get to take the power of the markets. I think that the markets can find the most cost-effective place to reduce carbon emissions in the world at any given moment. And it could be very expensive and very difficult to replace every single aircraft in the world with an electric aircraft. So that's going to take some time. But it turns out there are an enormous number of places where we can sequester and both reduce carbon emissions and sequester additional carbon in huge quantities by managing and replanting our forests. And in doing so, we can also help the local communities who are feeling the brunt of the effects of climate change and don't have the resources to address it. So by transferring wealth, by paying money to people living in the mangroves, living in the peat moss, living in the rainforests, who need help to survive, they can more cost effectively reduce global carbon emissions. And so the markets should do that. The markets should seek out everywhere on Earth and normalize pricing across carbon emissions until we get to a point where we stop. So it's really a win-win-win.
Describe avoidance versus removal, i.e. save a forest versus plant a forest.
Sure. Well, plant a forest is pretty straightforward, right? You plant a tree, it grows, it sequesters carbon. And that's great. Save a forest is much more complicated, because how do you know what's going to happen to that forest if you don't save it? So you can look at trends locally. You can look at the Brazilian rainforest and say, it's being cut down at a rate of X per year. And if you save a certain portion of it, then that process will go more slowly. But it's also possible that I invest $1 million to protect a forest and the owner just cuts the forest next door instead. So it's not additive. So it's very complicated to make sure that carbon offsets are not just wasting money. But here's another thing that's amazing about blockchain. We've seen over the last 20 years, a lot of carbon and forestry projects happen. And a huge portion of the money that goes to saving these forests is just siphoned off by corruption. But with blockchain, sure, it's all transparent. You can't do that if the money is properly tagged right through to the local community who is supposed to get X% of the money to feed their kids or to not cut trees or to do whatever sustainable practices that they've agreed to do in exchange for money. You can see that the local government hasn't stolen half or 3/4 of the money.
Another amazing thing again about the blockchain, and probably a comment that will get me in a little bit of trouble again, one of many I might add, Tom.
Seems like you get in trouble all the time.
Yeah, of course, from really both sides of the aisle and everything in between. So I'm an equal opportunity offender, let's put it at that. Yeah. Really look at all non-for-profit, philanthropic, and charitable organizations. Now, there's been some level of clarity in terms of where the dollar's going as a percentage, but it still is looking back We don't know if it's 100%. I mean, I guess we can maybe trust in an audit, but it's not 100% clear. When those organizations and many others go on the blockchain, it's 100% clear. And don't get me wrong, when you're working at one of those organizations, you deserve to be compensated a fair, quote unquote, salary and compensation relative to what you're doing. So no one's saying that 100% necessarily has to go, but you look at the track record of some of those organizations without the level of accountability that the blockchain could provide. And it's sad, it's not good. And eventually when this becomes more the standard, or they won't get any money, period, then everything will be much more authentic and transparent. Okay, off my high horse. Talk about some of the more interesting carbon offset types that exist, like methane capture, meaning old mines, old wells, landfill, manure, palm oil, rice waste. And then you have forestry, carbonites, generation, CCS. Again, I'm throwing a lot at you. Please simplify it for my audience.
Sure. Well, we emit carbon and methane. Methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon. It doesn't last quite as long, but it's like 20 plus times more powerful. So we emit a lot of methane and we emit a lot of carbon dioxide from a lot of different things that we do. And we're developing all kinds of cool new methodologies for sequestering it. And I think over time, the mechanical means of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere are going to become important. But right now, we've got amazing natural solutions to the problem. So you mentioned landfills. Landfills, the same as animals burping and farting and their manure turning into methane as it sits in the big ponds behind the pig farms. All of that stuff is a normal process of biodegradation. And in many cases, well, in the case of cows, we just need, really the only thing we can do is eat less beef. But in the case of many of the others, we can capture that over the latrines. We can capture the methane that's being emitted. We can capture the methane that's being emitted from the landfills, and we can turn it into energy, clean energy. And that's important because we do need energy. There's other projects. There's, as you mentioned, rice husks and palm oil. A lot of the effluent from those processes also biodegrades and creates methane. So you tent those up. This is job creating stuff. For sure, there's a lot of work to be done. Capping mines, there's a lot of mines in Appalachia, and there's a lot of people that want jobs there. So we can do all of this at the same time. And while I'm on the topic of the energy industry, I just want to point out that there are a couple of companies out there in the world who excel at putting platforms out in the ocean and attaching drilling or the equivalent of what could be a huge wind turbine on top of them. So if we think that there's no place in the future of energy for a BP or a Shell or an Exxon, we're wrong. We need those companies. We need to set up incentives for those companies to go and do different things. They're going to behave based on the incentives that we as voters and the government give them. They just want to make money. And they're amazing engineers. Who else is going to lay a power line, 20 miles off the Texas coast and then put a wind turbine or 50 of them out there? Nobody's going to do that except the oil and gas industry. So we need to embrace oil and gas. We need to redirect oil and gas. And if I hadn't said it already, we need to vote, vote, vote.
Yes, you did, but you bring up good points. What are scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions?
Yeah, so scope 1 emissions are your own emissions that you produce yourself by burning fossil fuels and driving and so forth, while scope 3 are upstream in your supply chain, ones that you have much less control over. So the different scopes have to do with where the emissions happen and how much control you have over it. So if you're Nike or Apple, you might have more control over your supply chain than a small company. If you're Amazon or Walmart, you can have much more control. Parts of it you control yourself because you have your own ships and your own cargo and trucks and so forth. But if you're a small company, your scope 3 emissions are going to be very difficult for you to control, except by choosing where and how you buy. So voting with your wallet as a company to choose supply chains that are carbon neutral. And as long as we're on the topic of supply chains, and we're here to talk about blockchain, once again, blockchain is going to allow tremendous transparency into the supply chain. And when coupled with carbon offsets, you can start shipping LNG gas offshore and attaching carbon offsets using blockchain and be able to at least deliver the natural gas in a carbon neutral fashion. So Air Carbon is currently doing that a lot. They work with shippers in the LNG gas industry to attach carbon offsets as part of the LNG contract.
And is offsetting enough? Meaning, can carbon offsets be combined with scope 1 reductions?
They should be, because you're not going to reduce your scope 1 to 0 immediately. So you really should do both. You should offset and reduce. It's going to be extremely difficult to get to net zero without offsets. I would say most companies it's going to be impossible. The airline industry is going to take decades to be able to build a 747 that flies on batteries and electricity.
That's decades.
Though it's happening.
Yes, it takes time.
It does. I think there's going to be short haul commuter flights from like Vermont to New York City on electric aircraft by the end of the decade.
What takeaway do I gain from, if I looked at the top 10 companies from 20 years ago, I think in the top 3 was Exxon. Yeah. Now look at the top 10 companies now, they're not in it. Actually, only one, Microsoft was in it 20 years ago. And Facebook, I think Zuckerberg was a senior in high school. It was still 2 or so years away from being created. Now, there is another company that came somewhat out of nowhere, was it 2007 or 8, that is in there, and that's Tesla. So is there a lesson there from look at how things changed over 20 years?
Well, I think it's very hard to compare Exxon and Microsoft. They're such different companies. But what I could say is that Exxon has an opportunity to participate in what is going to be the largest change in human society in ever, probably the fastest, largest change. As we decarbonize our society under threat of storms and wildfires and droughts and heat waves, it's going to be extremely fast change. And as I said, Exxon really knows how to go offshore and drill holes in the bottom of the ocean, and they could be putting up pylons for wind turbines. These companies have tremendous engineering skills. Who better to sequester? We're going to continue to use hydrocarbons for a while, right? So who better to sequester the carbon emissions associated with oil and gas than companies who are already drilling holes underground? So we can just be all Pollyanna about it and say, well, everyone should stop using carbon immediately. We should go off of fossil fuels immediately. But that's not realistic. As much as I'd like to see that happen, that's just not a realistic perspective. The world economy would come to a halt and a lot of people would starve to death. So that's also not a great option. So how do we, again, I'm back to the same topic. How do we enlist BP, Shell, Exxon, and all the other big petrochemical companies to help us solve the problem? And if Exxon finds the right solution, they will grow again.
Yeah, that was going to be my comment. So like they're even financially motivated, their board of directors, their shareholders, those that work there to regain, I guess you could say, some of their past glory, because we do need more energy. So that's something where they could actually, with maybe, let's go with more creative leadership, could potentially come out on the good side on.
So let's just say that these companies should become energy companies, not hydrocarbon companies.
Yes. And actually, when I mentioned Tesla in my example, at the heart of it, are they really an energy storage company?
Maybe, yeah, maybe they're an energy storage company, maybe they're an energy production company, and maybe they're an automated driver company. I don't know.
It seems like a combination of all of it.
Yeah, for sure.
Are there tools for investors or consumers to rank companies against each other when it comes to reducing their carbon footprint, and importantly, how they go about doing it? Is it purchasing carbon credits or reducing their own carbon emissions?
Yeah, so this is a tough one. There's a company called CSR Hub, which has some information. I have not found a really good central location for information on carbon emissions of different companies. You can look through their ESG reports, their annual reports, and try and compile that data, but it's not always clear what they're doing. In that regard, they don't necessarily want it to be clear, but I think it's going to become more and more clear as organizations like BlackRock insist on only investing their huge funds in companies that have certain ESG meet certain ESG requirements, and so companies around the world are scrambling to try and report on more and more information. That's part of this political process as well, right? We've got to set up the tax incentives to engender certain behaviors, but we've also got to give guidance to companies about what they need to report on so that we can choose the ones that we want based on this really incredibly important existential question of climate change.
What's the size of the carbon market today compared to, say, 5 years ago?
Well, I'd say like in the last year or so, the compliance carbon markets were on the order of $200 billion a year. And I would say the voluntary markets, the last report I said showed that they would be at about 50 billion a year by 2030. But I think that's a vast understatement. I think the voluntary carbon markets are growing rapidly. There's been tremendous demand from consumers and companies in voluntary carbon markets. So I think the voluntary carbon markets could be $100 billion, maybe more by the end of the decade.
Where do I go to sell that carbon credit? Is there a central exchange?
Yeah, well, I guess one of the questions is where did you get it, right? If you want to sell it, where did you get it? But if you're a carbon project and you want to sell it, most of the sales have happened OTC. There's a lot of brokers. They charge huge commissions, anywhere from 5 to 200% commissions on carbon offsets. And that's been changing as we've started to see more traditional exchanges set up. Exchanges like Air Carbon and Expansive are great exchanges where you can buy and sell carbon offsets. And you see the margins start to shrink. I think Air Carbon charges like 1%. So it's more in line with traditional commodities markets in terms of the exchange pricing. And so, there's this challenge in the marketplace between, what's a fungible carbon offset and what's a non-fungible carbon offset. And I think that the non-fungible market is going to be more of the voluntary market. We'll see NFTs represent really differentiated types of carbon offsets that different voluntary offsetters want to purchase, while the fungible space is going to be more within compliance. So there's very strict guidelines for the airline industry under CORSIA that indicate what carbon offsets meet the requirements for airlines to offset. And that's a fungible asset class, right? Anything that meets those criteria should fit within that contract. And on the other hand, the kind of carbon offsets that I deal with, different people want different ones. So if I'm working on a consumer product for Starbucks or Tim Hortons, they're going to want to be getting carbon offsets associated with the coffee growing districts of Colombia, Brazil, North Africa, and Indonesia. Whereas if I'm working with someone like IKEA, they may want carbon offsets associated with the spotted owls of the northern boreal forest where the wood pulp comes from. Every voluntary offsetter is going to have really specific needs around what they want and what vintages and so forth. I think it's interesting. Carbon offsets are an intangible asset. And I come from the advertising industry where we're also selling intangible assets, where ad fraud has always been a big issue because it's easy to fake. Well, the same has been true in the carbon space. And I think that we're going to see blockchain is going to help reduce the fraud associated with double counting. It's easy to pretend you planted a tree, but verifying it is harder. It's easy to say, I showed an ad, but verifying that you did in fact show the ad and that it was a human that saw it, not a bot, is more challenging. So those markets have a lot in common with each other.
When it comes to the compliance markets and involuntary markets, what is the distinction and why are there two different marketplaces that are required?
Yeah, so on the compliance side, most countries have certain industries that are required to emit a certain amount or less. So as a result, you have markets like the California cap and trade. We've got the RGGI markets around energy production in New England. We've got the offset-based pricing in Canada. They've got the EUA system in Europe, and many different countries have these. So if you're in high intensity carbon industries, making cement, steel, electricity, etc., you have to cap your emissions. And if you don't, then you need to buy offsets. And those offsets fit into very specific fungible buckets. There are certain types of projects, certain vintages, which meet the compliance requirements. On the voluntary side, this is pressure from consumers and just general desire on behalf of corporations and individuals to offset. So they can buy anything they want. They can buy high quality, they can buy low quality, they can buy a lot, they can buy a little, but they tend to care a lot more about what the offset is, as opposed to just wanting to make sure that it meets the minimum requirements.
What is greenwashing?
What is greenwashing? Well, greenwashing is pretending you're carbon neutral or pretending that you're environmentally friendly, when in fact, you may go out and buy 1 million tons of carbon offsets, but they're really, really low quality carbon offsets from, a solar project in some part of the world that would have been built anyway. Additionality is a really key item in the carbon space. So if you're going to offset your carbon emissions, you want to make sure that the money that you're putting into those carbon offsets is going to change behavior, to remove additional carbon from the atmosphere. You don't want your money to be going into doing something that would happen anyway. So that's what a really low quality one. You might pay 50 cents a ton for carbon emissions associated with a profitable solar panel, when instead you could be paying $15 a ton for an unprofitable cook stove in a hut in Africa that is doing many different things. When you buy a more efficient cook stove for a woman living in a hut in some developing part of the world, you're improving her health and her children's health because they're not breathing in the smoke that comes into their home. But you're also reducing the carbon emissions. You're reducing the amount of time that they need to spend collecting firewood, which is both dangerous and especially for women, but also not a good use of time. So there's so many benefits to cook stove related carbon offsets that go beyond just the carbon emissions. And that's where we start to bring in things like sustainable development goals that are met by certain carbon projects. And that's where I start to get involved from voluntary perspective in valuing carbon offsets.
What should the role, I guess hinted at it earlier, but what should the role of oil and gas industry be in the carbon offset space?
The oil and gas industry is going to continue to produce oil and gas. That's going to happen for a while. Humanity needs that energy. Not producing the oil and gas would be a humanitarian crisis of epic proportion if we just stopped today. So that's going to continue to happen, but they can do it maybe less profitably, but they can do it more responsibly. They can stop leaking methane. They can stop, they can make sure they're flaring wherever they can. They can collect the methane that they're flaring and generate energy from it. They can cap closed mines. They can start building the new infrastructure for the future of energy. They can put in wind turbines. They can be building massive solar farms. Exxon should be putting a bazillion solar panels into Arizona and building huge power lines to bring that power to other parts of the country. There's plenty of roles for the oil and gas industry to be involved in if they want to. And also, we're going to continue to need petrochemicals for manufacturing and other purposes anyway.
What does securitizing carbon credits mean?
Well, it means the same thing I would say as securitizing any kind of commodity or asset. It means creating a digital receipt. When you securitize gold or when you securitize oil, you're putting it into a digital form, a receipt, so that someone can trade it. And then later on, you take physical delivery, or you don't, depending on what your purpose in purchasing oil is. You know, a lot of people had oil contracts that required physical delivery at a certain point, and suddenly with COVID, the market's all locked up, and nobody could take physical delivery because all the storage was full. So it's the same thing with carbon offsets. So from a blockchain perspective, we're building bridges between the physical commodity, which is intangible, carbon offsets, and the blockchain. And those bridges can be one-way bridges or two-way bridges. So Air Carbon has a two-way bridge. They tokenize, they take your carbon offsets, they sequester them in a bankruptcy remote custody provider, and then they issue you a digital receipt. And that digital receipt is a token. You can trade that token. You can trade it on their platform. Potentially, you could take it off their platform and trade it somewhere else. But if anyone wants to take physical delivery of the carbon offsets, they need to bring it back to the original platform that did the tokenization, turn in that token, burn the token, and then they get the carbon offsets back. It'd be the same thing as you wanted to go pick up corn or oil or gold. You can take a physical delivery of your commodity.
Well, Tom, let's bring up another sensitive topic. We've been actually too nice for the last 10, 15 minutes. Let's talk a little bit about energy and what we're talking about in Bitcoin. Now, let's not get too deep in the mud. Bitcoin uses proof of work. That uses a lot of energy, but arguably, or more than arguably, legitimately, it makes it very secure so far and truly decentralized. You mentioned BlackRock and a lot of the big institutional organizations. When BlackRock talks, people listen. And when they put out certain ESG mandates and all that, what I'm basically getting to is a lot of institutions I know are kind of chomping at the bit to get involved in crypto in the digital space. But a lot of them are really being very careful and holding back for now. Not all of them, but a lot of them on Bitcoin for the ESG issues that I noted. Now, I guess they could invest in a ESG compliant Bitcoin miner, or they could even create one, perhaps in Texas, that mines quote unquote ESG compliant Bitcoin. Is the energy consumption of Bitcoin a big issue in the things that you're talking about? Or do you feel perhaps, if not overstated, other areas of the financial system that are more traditional are understated relative to their true energy consumption?
So no, I don't think it's overstated. I think Bitcoin uses a lot of energy. It's a very carbon intensive process, but there are many solutions. Remember, we were talking about fungible versus non-fungible. So the fact that I hold a Bitcoin that might or might not have been mined in a Texas solar powered Bitcoin mine versus in a coal-fired mine in China, it isn't really relevant. It's fungible. So the entire ecosystem really needs to address that, and they can. If you want to invest in Bitcoin and you have ESG requirements, then your suggestion is great. Invest in a Bitcoin miner that is solar powered or renewable energy powered. That's great. You know, El Salvador is trying to get people to mine Bitcoin based on thermal power in the volcanoes. So there's lots of different ways to go about that. But I don't see Bitcoin as really a long-term necessary asset class unless it can get past this, unless the vast majority of the mining can be made carbon neutral. And that would be possible. But you talk about the value of Bitcoin being that it's truly decentralized and much more secure. But Ethereum is pretty decentralized and very secure as well. Both of them are slow. Ethereum is changing.
Right, to proof of stake, supposedly, eventually. Let's see if it happens next summer.
No, it's going to happen. I'm confident it's going to happen in Q1.
We'll see.
I thought it was going to happen in Q4, but I think it's coming. It's already live. You know, Ethereum 2.0 is already out there, and you can get involved with it already. So I think that's going to happen. It has to happen. But the challenge with a blockchain like Solana, which I like a lot, it's not as decentralized, and that's an issue.
Although it is number one, which I don't quite get, on being decentralized per the Nakamoto coefficient. Shockingly, I even know about that. But my issue with these kind of things is who's setting the rules relative to what makes up, in this example, centralized versus decentralized. So I tend to look at some of these things with a skeptical eye.
But who's
yes,
setting up the rules at the New York Stock Exchange? And you know, so it's all the same. Why do you think that we have people investing whatever hundreds of millions of dollars in doing fiber optic cables from Chicago to New York? It's because someone knows what the rules are, and someone is, trying to take advantage of an extra nanosecond to front run trades, and that's allowed because the New York Stock Exchange allows it, right? So I think if you look at the,
I'm kind of saying that they kind of pick the winners.
Yeah. Oh, they do pick the winners. And if you look at the governance for the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ versus the governance for Cardano versus Solana, I think that you'll find a lot more transparency and a lot more community involvement in both Cardano and Solana than you would in NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange.
Oh, for sure. But a little bit back to my eerie comment that I made, I'm not so sure that those in positions of power appear to kind of want Solana to be the winner. And if they do, I wonder if that's the horse to bet on. I don't know. It could go up, it could go down. I have diversity in my crypto holdings because of that. I'm probably a little more optimistic about Bitcoin longer term than you. And what I will say, so I'm the maximalist, hate me already, even though I'm effectively a believer and a supporter. I do think, let me be careful how I phrase this because I'm not an expert on it. I'm going to put it this way, that traditional TradeFi, traditional finance, let's even pick on Visa and MasterCard, although Visa at least pretty cool now, buying the crypto punks. So I'll say that about them. But again, who sets the rules on the parameters of how things are measured? On the surface, Bitcoin appears to use a lot more power, quote unquote, pound for pound than Visa for a transaction. But how about when you factor everything in? All the buildings of Visa, the energy usage, the people that get there. There's lots of little nuances where I think those numbers are closer than those that want to portray a certain position would like them to be. So I'm finally going to get a little bit of a thumbs up from the Bitcoin people. Thank you. So give me a little bit of love, but why don't we move on from that? And I do have a fair number of questions relative to NFTs that we're going to get to, but let's talk a little bit. Let's talk about carbon exchanges. You started your work in carbon offsets doing business development for Air Carbon. Can you talk a little bit about Air Carbon?
Sure. Well, when I started at Air Carbon, I was the third employee there, and they didn't have a product yet. So while I joined to be head of biz dev, and living in Singapore, that was great for me because I hadn't been there that long, and I wanted to network throughout Southeast Asia and meet more people. So being in a biz dev role was great. But in reality, I ended up doing an awful lot of product development. It was early stages. Air Carbon has a brilliant CTO, and I learned a lot from working with him and the founders about how carbon trades, how the carbon markets work, and also a tremendous amount about futures and options and how those are being translated into the world of distributed finance as well. So as I said, Air Carbon is a B2B carbon trading exchange. They tokenize carbon into fungible tokens along different kinds of market dynamics like the aviation industry and nature-based solutions. And they write contracts that define what fits in those buckets, and they allow buyers and sellers to trade. But one of the things that surprised me, I expected it would be harder to find buyers. And in fact, it's turned out to become more and more difficult to find sellers. The carbon markets are short. And when I started Metacarbon, a number of people, including one of my investors, who had told me that one of the reasons they were investing is because they wanted me to buy carbon offsets from them, said, we're not going to really sell much in the way of carbon offsets. We're holding pat, and we think it's best to be long carbon. And so just in the 4 months that I've been running Metacarbon, I've seen the price of carbon go from $8 to over $15 a ton in the kind of forestry projects I'm looking at.
And checking in a little bit on time, Tom, I probably have about 4 to 5 questions left. Would you have till about 10 minutes after the top of the hour?
Sure, especially if we get to talk about carbon creatures.
We're going to get to that now, then we're going to get to a whole bunch of NFT stuff. So you're the CEO and founder of Metacarbon. Can you tell us a little bit about what your company does and effectively what their mission is?
Sure. Mostly what we're doing right now is having fun. I mean, what an amazing space to be in. To be at the intersection of NFTs and carbon is just super exciting. There's so much cool stuff going on. Basically, what we're doing is we're using NFTs, collectible NFTs, to raise money for habitats for endangered species. More or less, that's how it works. But why have we chosen to do it through carbon offsets? And 40% of the revenue that's generated from this NFT sales go to purchasing carbon offsets. But the carbon offset industry is really well defined in terms of what's the quality, how is it measured, what kinds of impact does it have? And our view is that consumers who want to invest in carbon offsetting want to be able to have transparency and understand exactly what the impact of their dollars is. So when we choose carbon offsets to purchase associated with our NFTs, we look at which sustainable development goals are being addressed by the carbon offsets. What kinds of extra certifications do they have? And then we gamify that process. So our NFTs are 32 different endangered animals. And each animal has a number of different traits, one of which is the SDGs that they address. Another is the endangered status. And we allow people to collect these NFTs, these carbon creatures, and they can level them up or power them up in a gaming concept by putting more carbon offsets into them. That allows us to start having some interesting competition. But our roadmap includes things like allowing carbon creature owners that have more than one creature to do breeding. So if you have 2 carbon creatures, you can breed them and have an airdrop of a baby carbon creature. There's a lot of different things within the carbon ecosystem that will be turning into NFTs. But all of it is really in an effort to increase the transparency from the point of sale and the consumer right back down to the impact at the ground, wherever the carbon offset is coming from.
Yeah, and that really, as we discussed already, the great aspect about blockchain and effectively Web3 and NFTs is the incredible transparency that we probably pounded home pretty good. So in terms of the development of your company and how people could be active in, and you have it now in the backdrop of your green screen, like how could one go about buying one, for lack of a better word?
So we're offering the ability to buy NFTs in a lot of different ways. First of all, we're not selling NFTs because my credit card processor would prefer not to hear that we're selling NFTs. We're selling carbon offsets.
One day that will change.
That will change. We're talking with Circle right now about payment processing gateways, and gosh, they're expensive compared with Stripe and PayPal. They're doing like $1,000 a month in just service fees just to have the account open. So I think eventually we'll be there. I think their pricing will come down, and we'll end up working with an organization like that. But for right now, if you want to buy one of our NFTs, and maybe for some of your audience, this would be the first NFT that they buy. We allow you to do it with a credit card, and we allow you to do it with ETH or Matic, or another token called Pearl.eco. And if you have a wallet, we're on the Polygon network, which has very, very small carbon footprint and very, very low transaction fees. So there's no gas costs to the buyer. If you have a wallet, we'll drop your NFT into your wallet in a more typical minting process that you might have seen with Bored Apes or Fluff Bunnies or CryptoPunks. But if you don't, we set up proxy wallets. Now here again, like there's so much language that matters. I'm thinking about doing a whole bunch of stuff that our technology is prepared to do, but our legal infrastructure is not prepared to do. So we have to wait on. But really what that means is we're taking custody of your NFT. We just call it a proxy wallet because then we don't have to deal with the word custody. And So you don't need a wallet. You don't need MetaMask. You don't need any of that. You just log into our website in a traditional fashion, and you can see your NFT there, your carbon creature. You can top it up, level it up. If it's your child's NFT, you can, put more carbon in for them so that they can get extra backgrounds and unfreeze their creature and all the different gaming activities. And if at any point you want to take that NFT out of the proxy wallet and put it into your own direct controlled wallet, we allow for that to happen for free as well, because again, we're on Polygon network, which is a side chain of Ethereum, where gas prices are basically zero. So I would encourage your viewers to visit carboncreatures.com, where they can buy one, or contact me directly and I can set that up as well. I'm on LinkedIn, easy to find. And then, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we closed a seed financing, and we're now in the middle of our Series A safe note, and we're basically half subscribed to that. And I've started so many companies. I have never been involved in a financing exercise that was this quick. Everybody is excited to get involved with what we're doing, and so we're lucky in that regard. But again, we haven't closed the round. We're only looking for $1 million. So anyone that would like to hear more about that should also reach out to me.
Yeah, of course. And of course, that may apply more to probably accredited investors per se, but we definitely have interesting investors in the audience, and feel free to go to the website and have a chance to reach out directly to Tom. I will add, from my perspective, we do this for education and entertainment purposes. Opinions change, regulatory issues change. Things may be different a day or a month from now. I don't know when you're going to be watching this video. Also, you have your own situation, timelines, risk tolerances, etc. You need to do your own homework. You need to effectively make your own decisions. And when you invest, there is something that could happen that is not always positive. You could lose money. So you must understand that.
9 out of 10 startups fail, as we know. I do a lot of entrepreneurship classes at Ohio State and universities in Singapore, and that's something I always try and hammer home. Can I mention something else interesting that happened to me the other day? I had an investor who said, well, I'm sort of interested, but I don't really want to join your safe note. I'd like to buy 20% of all of your NFTs for the next year at a fixed price today. And we're talking about, almost $500,000. And I thought, okay, well, is this person accredited? Does it matter if they're accredited? This is kind of strange. Like, is it okay how can you imagine if you're making sneakers and someone says, well, I don't want to invest in your sneaker company, but I'd like to buy, 20% of your sneakers at a fixed price up front. That's sort of what it was like.
Okay, let's go a little round robin, and a little bit on that subject. I'm going to hit upon something with that I've been thinking about, and I'm not the first one to bring this up. Other more prolific thought leaders than me in the community have brought it up, but it relates a little bit to what you just said. And that is the system rigged and unfair to the little man, to the average person? Is it really geared to only people that are accredited, or probably even more, 5 million or above qualified purchasers? Because apparently our own government and many governments feel that people below that threshold, apparently they can't make their own decisions what they want to do with their money, investing in earlier stage companies that some could do very, very well. The government has to protect them, and only people, whether they created it or inherited it, who have quote unquote a lot of money, have access to certain opportunities that help their wealth to potentially become more profound and grow. I could argue, is it really protecting 98% of the population that doesn't qualify, or is it limiting and controlling them?
Well, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, it would be easy for me to say, look at all of these crypto millionaires and crypto billionaires who a year or 5 years ago had nothing and just happened through luck to get involved because they found something was interesting. I tried and failed to buy my first Bitcoins at under $1. I was in between jobs. It was 2010, 2011. I was like, wow, look at this Bitcoin thing. It's kind of interesting. I'd like to try and buy some. And I had, $100 or $1,000. And I spent a lot of time trying to buy Bitcoin and I failed. And then I got a job. And so I sort of forgot about it for 7 years. And then I said, well, gosh, I'd be a billionaire today if I'd, bought $100 worth of Bitcoin at 25 cents or whatever. So there's definitely arguments to be made that distributed finance and crypto makes investing in riskier, higher return type opportunities more broad. But then I look at things like Dogecoin and I mean, seriously, do you think that Elon Musk is not playing around in these marketplaces in the background? You don't think he drops $1 million into the latest dog themed cryptocurrency before he says something about it and it goes up, 75,000%? I don't buy it. I don't buy it.
There is no question. Again, the people in position of influence, power, and money,
right,
things are kind of rigged to them. Now, he's a highly unique example.
Highly unique, but not alone, because you look at a lot of these different markets, and I'll tell you, from the launch of my NFTs, it's very easy for me to see how I could be manipulating this market. Should I be? Is it my job to try and set the market up so the price of my carbon creature NFTs goes up?
Yeah, I mean,
okay. Yeah,
there are
right.
Things, right.
But there's a lot of different ways I can do it. I can go out there and do a lot of social media and podcast interviews and generate a lot of interest, or I could be buying my own NFTs.
Well, let's keep on chopping it up here, Tom, because we're getting into some interesting shit. I guess I can use that word. So staying on the meme coins, which appear to be almost a religious like fervor by a lot of Generation Z, because I would look at it at my age and say it has really no utility per se, AKA whatever, the Floki Udu or one of those. But maybe as an investor, I could say, wow, as a sub-asset class of crypto, I think memes are the highest performing, or at least the top 10 as aggregate in the last year. I have to realize the power of network effect and community. So that would be my part number one, but where we're going to get probably a little bit in a different direction. Let's take Shiba Inu. Started off as a dog meme. We know about the person who over, I think, a month put $8,000 in. That wallet now has about 5.6, give or take a little bit, billion. I'm going to assume that's the anonymous founder. And it very well might be someone who's very well known. We just don't know. Here's what I will say about Shiba Inu. It grew in community and network effect, and they under-promised and over-delivered. They actually do have swaps. They did drop NFTs. They're supposedly building out gaming, their own blockchain. I mean, I'm going to get again in trouble for saying this, but I've said it on another podcast. I think it's legit. I mean, I think it's going to hang around even after an inevitable bear or winter. It may lose a hell of a lot. What do you think?
I think it could, but it could also just be a Ponzi scheme. And then the question is it a huge wealth transfer from this Gen Z to a few whales that started all out and then sold into the downside? This is why I'm not 100% convinced that we don't need some regulation. In fact, I'm 100% convinced we do need regulation. I think regulation is what's going to bring even more validation to the crypto space.
The regulation that is trending in the US now, and we may have different perspectives, it appears to be relatively pretty friendly to Bitcoin, and with Gensler and others, maybe not as friendly to more complex things like stable coins, DeFi, staking in crypto. I'm being a libertarian, more of a believer of much, much less government, less taxation. Don't call me a grouchy old curmudgeon, and I'm very open and quote unquote progressive on social issues. But I don't like it being stifled. Imagine if the internet was stifled, which came a little close 30 years ago here in the US. China's probably making some mistakes. are we going to make mistakes? And are we going to leave the door open to an India to be the true next superpower 20 or 30 years out? Boy, that's a lot to chew on and answer in 1 minute.
Yeah, I mean, I think I hear you. I'm not sure that I would say I'm libertarian, but call me conservative anyway. And I think nonetheless, we do need some regulation in the space. I think this DeFi stuff is super complicated. I think the difference between USDC and USDT is massive. And I think that people need to be, at a minimum, forced into some transparency. You know, I want to know, I know with USDC that it's $1 to coin, and it's fiat. Whereas USDT, Tether is, you know, who knows what it is? It could be a whole bunch of shady Chinese paper. I have no idea. They won't really tell us. And I think they need to be forced to. But I just see the system taking advantage of people that don't have knowledge and experience and are just trying to make their way. And so, you know, it bothers me that people can be either forced or tricked into payday loans that they don't understand, that are clearly not good for them. It just makes me sad when I see people doing things that are clearly not good for them.
It's not really changing directions because it's all going to kind of tie together. But in terms of my listeners and viewers thinking about quote unquote NFTs, do they look at it per se as whatever, a CryptoPunk or something like that, as artwork, as a store of value? I mean, as a store of value, CryptoPunks hasn't even been challenged yet in terms of going down. So I guess theoretically, for whatever the last year or so, it's been a great store of value. Why is it a worse store of value than Bitcoin? Now, you could argue Bitcoin's been tested over its 12, 13 years with 3 significant down markets. And again, we could get into the halving cycle and all that.
There's one major difference.
What's that?
Sorry to interrupt. There's one major difference. Bitcoin has a fuckload of liquidity. That's right. I mean, that's a huge difference between CryptoPunks and Bitcoin. But at one time, Bitcoin didn't have that, probably even leading into whatever, 2013 or 14. Yeah. So CryptoPunks could, and Bored Apes could have that kind of liquidity. But I think when you look at the NFT market, you've really got to look at a few different things. I think most of these projects are going to go to zero. But the ones that aren't are the ones that are trying to generate genuine utility. Either they're associated with longstanding brands like NBA Top Shot, or they're trying to associate themselves with longstanding brands like Bored Apes trying to get involved in the music industry.
Yes, they are.
Right?
It's
That's
pretty
interesting.
crazy.
But many of them are just like squiggles and other kinds of weird artwork that, you know, are kind of interesting, but I don't see them as having long-term value.
Let me bounce around that one a little bit. I mean, I could look at contemporary art if I was an old guard perceptive from the 1950s saying, what the hell is this shit? So I think the word intrinsic value and utility could, I'm not saying it's always wrong, but it could be overrated. When it comes to the world of art, does the Mona Lisa have any intrinsic value?
You're absolutely right.
I like to look at it.
I can't argue with you, but my opinion is that most of this artwork is really not particularly compelling artwork. It's just someone who decided to do generative art, came out with an outline and a bunch of things they put on top of it. And if they don't take it to the next level, if they don't have a roadmap towards bringing value to the owners, then, you know, I don't see the long-term value. Now, there are some cases where I think the Mona Lisa, for example, there are some iconic artists who broke the mold when they did whatever piece of art that they did that just, like, you know, changed the world or changed the world of art. And I think that you're going to see that a few of these NFT artists are that. I do believe that the CryptoPunks and that the Bored Apes are going to be seen as iconic turning points in a new form of artwork that are going to have intrinsic long-term value. But there are thousands of wannabes. And one of the things I like about my carbon creatures is that although they have really high quality 3D art, that's in 3D environments, that's going to be able to be animated and played with and so forth. We also have a real utility. This is a consumer interface for a carbon accounting platform that adds a lot of value to addressing climate change and engaging brands and engaging the customers of a brand in addressing the issue of climate change. So that's our primary goal. Maybe I didn't even say that, but Carbon Creatures, or Metacarbon in general, is designed to help brands engage their consumers, brands and celebrities and influencers engage their communities on the topic of climate change. We're a B2B2C.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And maybe as a final thought relative to what you said, I would probably agree that probably, I don't know, at the next bear winter, which is inevitable in really any market, probably 90% of NFTs will go to nothing. I do think CryptoPunks will have long-term value. They'll go down, and then they'll probably, like my example of Bitcoin, they'll also bounce up and have a new higher floor. Bored Ape Yacht Clubs, I may not be quite as confident on, but I'm pretty confident on. You could argue Cool Cats and some others. Now, this brings up the question going back to regulatory. Right now, it's a little complicated. You're actually making it easier, but I don't think, no offense to grandpas out there, but you're probably not getting on MetaMask, downloading ETH, going into OpenSeas and paying gas fees and figuring, I mean, you might be able to figure it all out. Just put some work to it or call me and I might be able to help. But in general, this is a little bit in, I think, rarefied air with cyberpunks and those that have resources and know the community. But here's my question. What happens when this is much easier on Coinbase next year? And then average people, let me pull that word back, those that are not as deeply experienced in the digital asset ecosystem, or maybe using more money than they could afford to lose. Why don't I put it that way? And then boom, of course, Murphy's Law, we have a bear market and people get hurt. I mean, are you concerned about that?
I am. I'm very concerned about that. I think that is for sure going to happen. But I think that's pretty typical. I think that's,
yes.
Normal cycles. I'm making sure at least that what I'm doing is genuine. That's the best that I can do. And I think a lot of people will find it very difficult to access this market. We're making it much easier with our proxy wallets and our credit cards. But I think, to secure, to get a Trezor and as a backup wallet and connect that to your computer. I'm super crypto savvy, and I've spent a good portion of my life as an engineer. I spent a lot of hours this morning trying to get the Trezor bridge up and trying to get it connected to OpenSea and MetaMask so that I can secure all the wallets associated with my business in an InfoSec compliant fashion. It was hard. Like, the engineers that I've been working with have been working for weeks to set up our contracts. And then the last bit is that I need to issue them as the CEO. I have this sheet of paper here that's going, which you can't see because of my green screen, that's going to go to the attorney's office because it's got 24 keywords. But setting that all up, it was hard.
My final question, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, in 10 years, which one has the highest market cap?
Tough question. I'm going to answer by saying I'm longest Solana. And I'm shortest, well, I'm not short Bitcoin, I'm long Bitcoin. I'm long all three. But I'm longest Solana, and Ethereum is my number 2 holding. That's not because I think Solana is going to have more long-term value. I just see it as having more near-term upside potential. I'm looking at the increased transaction volumes. I'm looking at the growing developer base. I'm yes, thinking about, as I do my engineering, I'm going to port to Solana from Polygon for a lot of different reasons. And I see lots of other engineers doing the same thing. So I know Solana's got legs, and that's why I'm long Solana. I'm also equally long Cardano, but it's a little bit less, only because Solana's been up more than Cardano over the last year.
But true. And Tom, again, for those that want to go to the website, what's the website URL?
So our website is carboncreatures.com, and tomorrow you'll be able to buy.
Oh, all right. Perfect timing.
Perfect timing.
On that note, everyone, I'm Angelo Robles, host of the Angelo Robles podcast, the founder at Family Office Association. We hope you enjoyed today. You can learn more about my organization, Family Office Association, on familyofficeassociation.com. Maybe you want to be a member. I'm also very active on social media. Check us out and subscribe on YouTube. We're simply Family Office. It's very easy. Tom, this has been great. I look forward to our part 2, and I wish you the best of success.
Thank you, Angelo. It was a lot of fun for me too.
My pleasure. Thank you.